New Zealand sells you a very particular postcard. Turquoise water folding onto black sand. A fishing boat idling in a harbour at dawn. Gulls circling behind it. Families on a wharf somewhere in the Bay of Islands, sunburnt and happy, hauling in snapper for the barbecue. That is the New Zealand you see on the Tourism Board's Instagram feed. And it is not wrong, exactly. It is just incomplete. Underneath that same water, scattered from the subantarctic cliffs of the Auckland Islands to the fog-bound reefs off Northland, there are steel hulls the size of city blocks lying on their sides in the dark. There are naval frigates sunk on purpose so that fish could move in and people could swim through their corridors. There's a Soviet cruise liner. There is a Greenpeace flagship blown up by a foreign government's secret service. There is a fortune in gold that nobody has ever found, sitting under a cliff at the bottom of the world. Today I'm taking you to 12 of them. Some you can book a dive charter for this weekend, kit up in a wetsuit and be swimming through the wreckage by lunchtime. Some sit in water so cold, so remote, or so legally restricted that almost nobody who wants to see them ever will. What they share is this. Each one is a moment when the postcard version of this country met the real one, and the real one won. Go on, subscribe, and I will tell you the whole story. Number 12. The Wiltshire, Rosalie Bay, Great Barrier Island. In May of 1922, the Wiltshire was 10 years old, and near the end of a long haul from Liverpool, loaded with over 10,000 tons of cargo bound for a country still rebuilding after the Great War. Household goods, motor cars, whiskey, building materials, 2 entire steam locomotives destined for railway lines on the North Island. She had carried thousands of New Zealand troops to the Middle East during the war, and now she was bringing the ordinary stuff of peacetime home. The night she died was filthy. Torrential rain, an easterly gale, visibility so poor the captain lost sight of the Cuvier lighthouse that should have told him exactly where he was. A lead line sounding showed water shallower than expected, and still the Wiltshire held her course a fraction too long. She struck rock below the cliffs of Rosalie Bay and broke in two within a day, the stern section sliding into deeper water while the crew clung to the bow. Locals on horseback reached the wreck before official rescuers did. A breeches buoy was rigged from a line thrown ashore, and every one of the 113 men aboard, plus the ship's cat, came off alive. A remarkable outcome given the conditions, and one that owed almost nothing to official response and almost everything to islanders who simply saddled up and rowed toward the disaster in the middle of the night. What the sea kept was the cargo. 2 locomotives that never reached their railway, delaying construction work on the North Island's main lines for months, and enough whiskey that Great Barrier Island residents were reportedly burying barrels in the sand before customs officers arrived to confiscate them. Divers still visit what is left of her today, a scattered, sea-smoothed field of iron in clear water off the island's eastern coast. Propeller blades and boilerplate half buried under decades of shifting sand. Officially, it was pilot error in appalling weather, a straightforward case of a ship too close to a coast she could not see. Unofficially, more than one old-timer on the island will tell you the Wiltshire's cargo built half the sheds and half the good times in that district for a generation afterward, and that a fair number of well-aged bottles turned up at family gatherings for decades without anyone asking too many questions about where they had originally come from. Make of that what you will. Number 11. The Tararua, Waipapa Point, Southland. This is the one New Zealand maritime history does not talk about as loudly as it should, and that silence is its own kind of strange. On the 29th of April, 1881, the steamer Tararua left Port Chalmers bound for Melbourne with 151 souls aboard and a cargo that included around £4,000 in silver coin. In the dark hours before dawn, somewhere past Nugget Point, the crew misjudged their position. Just after 5 in the morning, the sound of breakers gave them their first warning. It was already too late. The Tararua struck the Atara Reef roughly a kilometre from shore at Waipapa Point, and what followed remains in raw numbers the worst civilian shipping disaster in New Zealand's history. 131 people died, 12 women, 14 children among them. most of them washed from the deck and rigging over the course of a full day and night while the ship broke apart beneath them, close enough to the beach that onlookers could see faces in the water and could do almost nothing. Rescue boats tried and failed against the surf. A local farmhand rowed inland with the news, but by the time help organised itself, the sea had already finished its work. The court of inquiry blamed a lookout who failed to hear the breakers and a captain who never confirmed his position. A lighthouse went up at Waipapa Point 3 years later. For the ships that would come after, not for the ones already lost. The wreck site is protected now, low in the water and broken by more than a century of southern swell. Silver coins still occasionally surfacing in local hands after storms. There is a small cemetery near the point, and there is a national memory of the Tararua that has faded next to more famous disasters, which feels, frankly, like its own quiet injustice. The dead of Waipapa Point rarely make the highlight reel. They deserve better than that. Number 10. HMNZS Tui, Tutukaka Coast. Not every wreck on this list came to grief in a storm. Some were put down on purpose, and the Tui story is one of the stranger transformations in this whole list. From Cold War research vessel to nuclear protest mothership to a reef teeming with kingfish. Built in the United States as an oceanographic survey ship, she was leased to the Royal New Zealand Navy in 1970 and spent nearly 3 decades mapping the sea floor, studying sound transmission and magnetism in some of the loneliest stretches of Pacific water there are. Her most politically loaded chapter came at Marlborough Atoll, where the Tui served as an unofficial mothership to the international flotilla protesting French nuclear testing. The very same program, incidentally, that would later put a French government's operatives on New Zealand soil with explosives, a story we're coming back to later in this list. By 1997, the Tui's working life was done, and in February of 1999, she was towed out from Tutukaka, stripped of hazards and sent to the bottom on purpose, 2 kilometres off the heads, resting upright in around 30 metres of water. Divers with an advanced certification and a reasonable logbook now swim corridors that once carried sonar technicians tracking Soviet submarines and scientists charting the deep Pacific floor. The official record calls her a decommissioned research vessel repurposed as an artificial reef. What she actually witnessed during a career spanning the height of the nuclear standoff in the Pacific is a longer and considerably more interesting story than that clean sentence lets on. Number 9. HMNZS Waikato, Tutukaka Coast. A short swim from the Tui lies her near twin in circumstance if not in shape. A genuine warship, and one with teeth. HMNZS Waikato was a Leander-class frigate, twin 4.5-inch guns, torpedo tubes, a Wasp helicopter capable of dropping depth charges on a submarine. She served through the Falklands era, relieving Royal Navy vessels in the Indian Ocean so Britain's own ships could sail south, and she carried the weight of a genuine Cold War combat role for over 3 decades before the Navy finally stood her down. In November of 2000, the Waikato was sunk off Tutukaka in a world record scuttling time. 2 minutes and 40 seconds from the button being pushed to the ship disappearing beneath the surface. She now lies broken into 2 sections on her port side in around 30 metres of water, her bows separated from the rest of the hull, which gives divers an unusually intimate look at the internal structure of a genuine fighting ship, where the Tui asks you to imagine sonar technicians listening for enemy submarines. The Waikato lets you swim directly through a gun turret that was, within living memory, combat ready. The official version is simple: an obsolete frigate given a second life as a dive attraction and marine habitat. What lingers, at least for the divers who take their qualifications seriously enough to go deep into her broken hull, is a different feeling entirely. That you are moving through a machine built specifically to kill, now colonised entirely by fish. New Zealand has a habit of doing that with its old weapons of war. Sink them. Let the sea take the argument out of them. Number 8. HMNZS Canterbury, Deepwater Cove, Bay of Islands. Canterbury's naval career reads like a highlight reel of the 20th century's late Cold War flashpoints. Built in Scotland, commissioned in 1971, she stood in for Royal Navy ships in the Falklands Theatre alongside her sister Waikato, supported United Nations sanctions against Iraq, and served in the peacekeeping operation in East Timor. She was also present in 1973 at Marlborough during New Zealand's anti-nuclear protests. Engineered, in fact, with a sealed citadel specifically designed to protect her crew in the event of nuclear fallout. A detail that tells you exactly how seriously that standoff was taken at the time. By 2005, the frigate was worn out, corrosion eating into a structure that would have cost tens of millions to keep seaworthy. There was talk, briefly, of turning her into a floating hostel. Instead, enthusiasts at the Bay of Islands lobbied for something more permanent. And in November of 2007, just 14 kilograms of carefully placed explosive sent her down in Deepwater Cove near Cape Brett. She landed upright and almost entirely intact, which is rare enough among scuttled ships that divers now rate her among the best wreck dives in the country. A bridge you can swim straight through, a helicopter hangar still recognizable at 27 meters. The man who prepared the charges had, by that point, sunk more of the Royal New Zealand Navy's own ships than any enemy managed during the entirety of the Second World War. There is something almost comic about that fact sitting next to a frigate that once stood sentry against nuclear war. The Cold War ended everywhere else with treaties and speeches. In the Bay of Islands, it ended with a controlled explosion and 200 spectators on the cliffs above, come to watch a warship become a coral garden. Number 7. HMNZS Wellington, Houghton Bay. Originally built for the Royal Navy as HMS Bacante in 1969, this Leander-class frigate joined the Royal New Zealand Navy in 1982 and spent the better part of 2 decades in active service before decommissioning in 1999. What happened next turned into one of the largest single public spectacles in the capital's history. Prepared for years as a future dive attraction, the ship was towed to a position off Houghton Bay, just east of Island Bay, and on the 13th of November 2005 at 3:30 in the afternoon, someone pressed a button. 1 minute and 55 seconds later, HMNZS Wellington was gone from the surface. Over 200,000 people watched from the cliff tops and the beaches, a number worth sitting with, because it means roughly 40% of Wellington's entire population turned out to watch their own Navy's ship deliberately sunk in front of them. The mayor herself was among the first civilians to dive the wreck once police divers confirmed it was safe. She sits now at around 21 meters, accessible enough for divers with a basic open water certificate and a guide. Her 2 enormous bronze propellers removed and mounted on land as memorials, one at the historic graving dock near Te Papa, the other overlooking the very bay where she rests. It is an unusually gentle afterlife for a warship. No tragedy, no cover-up, just a city that decided its old frigate deserved a second act as a living reef instead of a scrapyard. Not every wreck on this list ends in grief. This one is proof that the sea can also be a kind of grace, if you let it. But that gentler chapter of New Zealand's underwater history is the exception, not the rule. If you thought a controlled scuttling with 200,000 witnesses was as strange as this list gets, wait until we get to number 4. Number 6. The Elingamite, 3 Kings Islands. The morning of the 9th of November 1902 was Edward VII's birthday, which is a detail nobody involved would have found funny at the time. The Elingamite had left Sydney 4 days earlier under Captain Ernest Atwood, carrying 194 passengers and crew, along with 52 boxes of coin, gold, half-sovereigns and silver, bound for New Zealand banks. As she approached North Cape, a thick fog rolled in, and Atwood, navigating by chart, aimed for what he believed was open water between the mainland and the Three Kings group. The chart was wrong. West King Island was not where it was supposed to be, and the Elingamite struck its cliffs at half speed, the order for full astern coming too late to save her. She sank in 20 minutes. 45 people died, 1 lifeboat vanishing entirely with everyone in it and never being found. A court of inquiry initially blamed the captain, until an Act of Parliament 9 years later forced a rehearing that finally cleared him. Once it was proven the chart itself had placed the island in the wrong position. Atwood, the court noted, walked into church with his head held high, the following Sunday. It had taken nearly a decade for the sea to stop being his fault. The coin never stopped calling people back. 2 salvage divers died of the bends attempting recovery in the years just after the sinking, working at depths their equipment could not safely reach. In the 1960s, a young Kelly Tarleton and Wade Doak, names that would go on to define New Zealand's recreational diving culture, rediscovered the wreck almost by accident while spearfishing, and over 5 years of expeditions pulled up lumps of solid silver coin weighing over 10 kilograms at a time. They also found the ship's bent propeller, physical proof of the engineer's account that it had jammed at the critical moment, unable to pull the Elingamite back from the rocks in time. The official record calls it a charting error. The wreck itself, sitting underwater so clear divers still hunt for stray half-sovereigns today, remembers it as the one small mechanical failure that turned a near miss into a tragedy. If a chart being wrong by a few hundred meters can sink a ship and kill 45 people, I would genuinely like to know what you think that says about how much trust we put in the maps we follow, at sea or otherwise. Leave it in the comments. I read every one of them, and this particular question tends to get people talking. Subscribe to show that these videos actually help, and that they make sense. It costs nothing, and it tells me this kind of digging into the country's coastline is worth continuing to do properly. Number 5. RMS Niagara, Bream Head. New Zealand liked to believe in June of 1940 that the war in Europe was a very long way away. That illusion lasted exactly as long as it took a German auxiliary cruiser called the Orion to slip undetected into local waters and lay 228 mines across the mouth of the Hauraki Gulf under cover of darkness. 4 days later, at 20 to 4 in the morning, the Trans-Pacific liner Niagara struck 2 of them off Bream Head, having just left Auckland on her regular run to Vancouver. The blast tore open her bow. Every one of the roughly 350 passengers and crew made it into 18 lifeboats and off the ship safely. The only casualty, famously, was the ship's cat. What went down with her was considerably more consequential to the war effort. 8.5 tons of gold bullion, 590 bars, being shipped in secret as payment to keep American munitions flowing to Britain during one of the darkest stretches of the entire conflict. The Bank of England wanted its gold back badly enough to fund one of the most dangerous salvage operations attempted anywhere in the world up to that point. Working from a converted steamer based in Whangarei, brothers John and William Johnstone made hundreds of descents in a custom-built diving bell to a wreck sitting in over 120 meters of water, a depth that, in 1941, sat right at the outer edge of what human divers could survive. They recovered 555 of the 590 bars. 5 remain unaccounted for to this day, somewhere in the wreckage or the silt around it. The Niagara still leaks oil from her bunkers more than 80 years later, and marine authorities continue to debate, without a firm answer, exactly how much fuel remains trapped inside her rusting hull, waiting for the day her structure finally gives way. Number 4. The Rainbow Warrior, Matauri Bay. This is the one item on this list that is not really a shipwreck at all, in the ordinary sense. It is a crime scene that New Zealand chose, deliberately, to turn into something else. On the 10th of July 1985, 2 operatives working for the French Foreign Intelligence Service planted explosives on the hull of the Greenpeace flagship Rainbow Warrior, while she sat moored in Auckland harbour, preparing to lead a protest flotilla against French nuclear testing at Marlborough, the very same testing program the Tui once shadowed as a mothership. The bombs detonated just before midnight. Photographer Fernando Pereira, a father of 2 who had joined the crew specifically to document the nuclear protests, drowned trying to retrieve his cameras from the sinking ship. What followed was, by any measure, an act of state terrorism carried out by an ally against a small, friendly nation. And New Zealand's response mixed genuine outrage with a very practical geopolitical bind. The 2 agents captured on New Zealand soil pled guilty to manslaughter and were sentenced to 10 years, of which they served less than 2. Quietly repatriated to France under a diplomatic settlement, promoted in the years that followed rather than punished, France eventually paid Greenpeace over $8 million American in damages and compensated Pereira's family. The commander of the operation was never captured at all, and only admitted his role publicly 2 decades later in an interview with New Zealand television. The ship herself, refloated for forensic examination and found beyond economical repair, was gifted a different kind of ending. Ngati Kura, the Tangata Wenua of Matauri Bay, offered her a resting place, and on the 12th of December 1987 the Rainbow Warrior was deliberately scuttled near the Cavalli Islands to become a dive site and a fish sanctuary, a living memorial standing where a ship built to protect the ocean now protects it permanently, sitting on the sea floor she once sailed above. A sculpture overlooks the water at Matauri Bay today, whether an act of terrorism against a country's own harbour carried out by a government that publicly denied everything for weeks was ever truly resolved by a settlement and a sculpture is a question that depends very much on who in this country you ask, even 40 years on. Number 3. The Wairarapa, Great Barrier Island. Some disasters happen because of one clear mistake. The Wairarapa happened because of a captain's reputation for competence, which turned out to be exactly as dangerous as incompetence when combined with fog, darkness, and a schedule he refused to slow down for. She left Sydney on the 24th of October 1894 under Captain J.S. McIntosh, a man passengers specifically chose to sail with because he was known as safe. 4 days later, rounding the top of the North Island toward Auckland, she ran into thick fog and kept going at close to full speed regardless, against the visible unease of her own crew. Just after midnight, the Wairarapa struck the cliffs at Miner's Head on Great Barrier Island with a crash reportedly heard for miles. Water poured through the hull. 16 crated horses on deck broke loose in panic, thrashing through passengers who had already been thrown from the tilting deck into the sea. Only 2 lifeboats launched successfully before the rest were smashed against the hull. A steward swam a line ashore at dawn, and around 50 people hauled themselves hand over hand through the water to the rocks, where they then waited more than 30 hours exposed to the weather before local Maori from Ngati Rehua at Catherine Bay found and rescued them. 121 people died. Some sources put the figure closer to 130, making it the 3rd deadliest shipwreck in New Zealand's history. Recovery of the bodies took 19 days, many of them buried where they were found in small cemeteries still visible today, surrounded by white picket fences at Wanpoto and Tapawai Point. The official inquiry laid the blame squarely on Captain McIntosh, who stayed aboard through the entire disaster trying to help others, and was ultimately swept overboard and lost himself. He never got the chance to answer for the decisions that killed 121 of the people who trusted him. The sea, in that particular sense, closed the case before the courts ever could. Number 2. Mikhail Lermontov, Marlborough Sounds. By the standards of everything else on this list, the sinking of the Mikhail Lermontov on the 16th of February 1986 should have been a minor embarrassment rather than a catastrophe. A Soviet cruise liner grazing rocks under local pilotage. Nothing more. Instead, it became the largest shipwreck in New Zealand's history, and one still tangled in enough unanswered questions to fuel documentaries decades later. The local harbour master, Don Jameson, was piloting the ship out through the Marlborough Sounds, giving the mostly elderly Australian passengers a scenic run close to shore. Near Cape Jackson, on a sudden impulse he later admitted he could not fully explain, Jameson steered the 155-metre liner through a narrow passage between a lighthouse and the headland, rather than the safer route around the outside. The hull tore open in 3 places, gashes 25 metres long, the sound of the impact reportedly audible 8 kilometres away. The ship limped toward Port Gore and sank there that night in 30 metres of water. A flotilla of local fishing boats, an inter-island ferry, and an oil tanker managed to rescue every soul aboard bar 1. A Russian refrigeration engineer, thought to have drowned in the initial impact, whose body was never recovered. New Zealand's Minister of Transport declined to hold a full formal inquiry, a decision that still strikes some as strange given the scale of what had happened. And the harbour master quietly surrendered his licence without ever fully explaining his last-second decision through the rest of his life. Rumours about the Lermontov being more than a simple cruise liner circulated almost immediately. A Cold War intelligence vessel, KGB officers among her crew, a Soviet submarine reportedly nearby the night she went down. Most experts who have studied the wreck dismiss the idea that she was deliberately sunk as far-fetched. Deliberately scuttling a ship of that size under controlled conditions is difficult enough on purpose, they argue, let alone as some kind of covert operation. What is not in dispute is that the wreck now sitting on her side in Port Gore has claimed at least 3 or 4 amateur divers' lives since, drawn in by an experienced one specialist diver called the Stuff of Nightmares, an entire 55-story building lying on its side in near total darkness, everything receding into gloom the moment your torch beam stops reaching it. Number 1. The General Grant, Auckland Islands. If you want to understand why this particular wreck still pulls treasure hunters south into some of the most violent water on Earth 160 years after it happened, you need to understand what it actually cost to survive it. On the 14th of May 1866, the General Grant, sailing from Melbourne to London with 83 people aboard and over 70 kilograms of gold locked in the captain's cabin, drifted becalmed onto the cliffs of the main Auckland Island in the darkness of a windless night. The current pushed her straight into a sea cave. The rising swell lifted her mainmast until it punched through the cave roof, and the ship sank exactly where she struck, entombed in rock. Only 15 people survived, 14 men and 1 woman, Mary Ann Jewell, a 22-year-old English maid travelling home with her new husband. What followed was 18 months of castaway survival on one of the bleakest, most storm-battered islands on the planet, kept alive by a single surviving match, which the group guarded so carefully it was never once allowed to go out for the entire ordeal. 4 men eventually attempted a 290-mile crossing to the mainland in a small boat with no compass, no chart, and no instruments of any kind. They were never seen again. 10 survivors were finally rescued by a passing whaling brig in November of 1867, so long fed on seal meat that witnesses described them as strangely well fed for men who had nearly starved. The gold never stopped calling people to their deaths. In 1870, 6 men drowned attempting a salvage expedition, including one of the original survivors of the wreck itself, killed trying to recover the very fortune that had already cost him 18 months of his life once before. In 1907, another salvage ship ran onto the cliffs of a neighbouring island and lost 12 more men. New Zealand's government eventually banned private expeditions to the Auckland Islands outright, calling them too perilous and too hopeless to justify the risk to human life. Access today requires a Department of Conservation permit, strictly capped, and the west coast of the island remains, according to the handful of professional salvage divers who have attempted it in recent decades, one of the hardest and most dangerous stretches of coastline they have ever worked. Savage swells, near freezing water, and a wreck still buried somewhere under more than a century and a half of rockfall. Its precise location never definitively confirmed despite 5 serious modern expeditions and counting. Some researchers argue the recorded gold shipment was only a fraction of what was truly aboard, smuggled aside from official manifests in the pockets and hems of returning miners who did not trust banks with their fortunes, or quietly transferred from another vessel just before departure. Others think the legend has simply grown in the telling, the way legends do when nobody can go and check, fed by 160 years of newspaper speculation, and at least one outright fraudster who tried to raise funds in New York in 1908 on the strength of a map that almost certainly did not show what he claimed it showed. Whichever version is closer to true, the General Grant remains exactly where the sea put her 160 years ago. Unrecovered. Unrecoverable by anyone without government permission and considerable nerve. And still, after everything, unfound. Mary Ann Jewell went on to live a long life after her rescue, though those who researched her later wondered privately what an 18-month ordeal as the only woman among 14 desperate men had truly cost her, a question the historical record is far too polite, or far too incomplete, to ever properly answer. 12 wrecks, 2 islands, 160 years of storms, fog, war, sabotage, and a handful of deliberate, almost tender decisions to let old warships become new reefs. What strikes me, looking at all 12 together, is how differently this country has treated its dead ships. Some it mourns properly, with cemeteries and lighthouses built from the lessons they taught the hard way. Silver coin, still occasionally washing up as a kind of quiet reminder. Some, it turns into spectacle, with 200,000 people on a clifftop watching a controlled explosion, or a nation's entire naval history condensed into a 14-kilogram charge, and a countdown. And some, it simply lets be, sealed in a cave at the bottom of the world, gold and all, because there are places even a nation as practical as this one decides are better left alone, no matter how many treasure hunters that decision frustrates. New Zealand's coastline does not just wreck ships. It decides afterward what kind of memory each one deserves: a lighthouse, a dive charter, a permit system, or simply silence and depth. Every one of these 12 is still down there right now, tonight, while you watch this. The water moves over them the same way it has for 160 years or 20. That says something about this place that the postcards never quite manage to capture. And it is the reason I keep coming back to stories like these, instead of the ones the brochures are happy to tell you for free. I am a grandpa, and grandpas worry. Look after yourself.
Bathed in golden light, the New Zealand coastline remains